Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third peer learning and exchange as part of the Inclusive Budgeting and Financing for Climate Change in Africa. We're so pleased to have you here today, where we'll be discussing some of the activities that have been taking place over the last 10 months on strengthening climate budgeting reforms, transparency, and accountability. So I'm going to be the overall facilitator for today, or actually over the next 2 days. And yeah, I look forward to the discussions and, sharing what we've been doing with you. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our Executive Secretary, Neil Cole, who will do the joint welcome address with Daisy Mukataraka, who is the Regional Climate Policy Advisor at UNDP. And Daisy is also leading on the program under Component B. And she's been very involved with a lot of the activities we'll discuss over the next 2 days. So Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bruman, and welcome everyone. It's a really warm day in Pretoria, so I suppose I should be saying a really warm welcome from Pretoria to all the participants that are with us today. The interest in the activities of this program, Integrated Budgeting and Finance for Climate Change in Africa, has been truly encouraging. And as you should know by now, it's a joint project by IIED, UNDP, CABRI, and IBP, and supported by CEDA. So as Shana said, my name is Neil Cole. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative. And our involvement in this program is that we lead Component A of this program, and we are also responsible for the overall coordination. Since October 2020, the IBFCCA program has been working to strengthen climate responsive budgeting in Africa, working closely with governments and civil society. And we certainly also see the work going forward, including legislators and also a select number of parliamentary staff, so that we are able to get to the full accountability framework. Under Component B, which I'm sure Daisy will speak of a bit more, that is led by the UNDP, the program has provided technical assistance to governments in designing reforms that lead to more climate resilient economies. And especially coming through this pandemic period and in the post-COVID period, how governments recover their economies will need to take into account climate change issues. There's some impressive work that has already been done under Component B, such as with Ghana in developing their second climate public expenditure and institutional review. Eswatini, previously known as Swaziland, developed a climate finance classification, coding and tagging system. Capo Verde has been assisted with an NDC financing framework. Namibia has been assisted in a feasibility study for the implementation of a climate budget tagging tool. And then there are preliminary discussions for a joint climate change and disaster risk reduction expenditure review in 6 West African countries, including Niger, Nigeria, Mali, and Senegal. Under Component C, that is led by IIED, the program has worked towards strengthening climate accountability and transparency. This includes the development of climate landscape assessments in Ghana and Uganda, and then partnering with governments and civil society to strengthen capability in this area. And that's certainly how we see this program developing going forward, to create that important country-level dialogue between civil society and government, whilst also paying very closely attention to building up a capability within governments, so that budgets that are produced, fiscal policies that are produced, are more climate responsive. So over the course of the two-day peer learning exchange, we will hear more about the initiatives under component B and C. And as you would have been many of you, part of previous activities presented by CABRI, today and tomorrow is not really going to be a focus on component A, but on component B and C. However, on Thursday, there will be a follow-on event to the Gender and Climate Change Peer Learning and Exchange event that was hosted by CABRI maybe just over a month ago. So we encourage you to attend this follow-on event on Thursday that will look into the piloting of new methodology on gender and climate change in program design and appraisal. I want to end by just thanking the partners, IBP, IIED, and UNDP, who have jointly organized this event, and also for CEDA for their support. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be part of the workshop for the rest of the day. I have to sign off soon to join a meeting of a team that we're working with at the National Treasury of South Africa on public entities. And then thereafter, I have to join an AU meeting on illicit financial flows. Depending on how all of that goes, I may be able to come back and join this meeting. But be that as it may, let me just wish everyone well, and thank you, Shanaz.
Great, thank you, Neil, for getting us started. I'll now call on Daisy to give her part of the opening remarks.
Thank you, Neil, for those opening remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, depending on where you are calling from. Thank you very much for joining these events. They are very, very important as the world moves towards low carbon and climate resilient development pathways. You will agree with me that domestic public finance is the single most important source of finance if we are talking about achieving SDGs and reducing poverty. And if we get that right, we leverage other sources of finance, we will be capable of unlocking the private finance that we so much yearn for. What we've been doing all along is what I can call a siloed approach. I'm sure you've heard gender budgeting. That has been on for almost 20 years. Climate budgeting is quite recent in Africa. You've heard about what we call biofuel, looking at biodiversity only and trying to mainstream that in the national budget, of course, driven by the tourism sector mainly. But what are we saying? We are saying we want integrated solutions. You will notice that this program, in all the 3 days, we are trying to mainstream both gender and climate in budgeting and finance. Why both? I mean, gender is important because we'll be addressing inequalities. We all know the development challenges that unequal societies face. So if we mainstream gender, we will be sure of addressing the issue of inequality. And climate change, like I've mentioned earlier, the global wave is towards low carbon climate resilient development. And even in this context of COVID, we are talking of green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is important that we mainstream both gender and climate. This program, I must say, particularly component B, is inspired by Asia Pacific, the Asia Pacific region. They have implemented a huge program on strengthening climate finance governance, and is beginning to yield development benefits. And as Africa, we want to move in that direction as well. We are not going to be left behind. We have countries that are quite ahead, as you heard Nick mentioning some of the countries, but we also have countries that are willing to start. So we really want those countries to exchange lessons and experiences as we move towards inclusive, low carbon and a climate resilient development pathway in Africa. I must say thank you very much to our donors, SIDA here present, and also to all the government officials here from the different ministries, Ministry of Finance, and also ministries of environment and other ministries, colleagues from private sector, thank you so much for attending, colleagues from civil society organizations, and all the other participants. Thank you so much. We look forward to fruitful discussions. Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Shanaz.
Thank you, Daisy. Thank you, Daisy and Neil, for those welcome address and for giving us more insight into the work that's been ongoing. I'm very pleased to now introduce Ulla Andrin. She's the head of the Regional Development Cooperation in Africa, the Embassy of Sweden based in Ethiopia. And we are very thankful to her for the continuous support of SIDA to this program. Ulla, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, bonjour, bon dia, from Addis Ababa. We also have a nice morning here after a lot of heavy rains. So, dear friends and colleagues, I'm very pleased to be here to opening this important peer learning and exchange event on strengthening climate budgeting reforms, transparency and accountability, and Sweden is glad to be able to support the inclusive budgeting and financing for climate change in Africa program. As the Conference of the Parties number 26 is approaching, the IPCC's 6th assessment report has been released, and it addresses the most up-to-date physical understanding of the climate system and climate change, bringing together the latest advances in climate science. And having read the word urgent really becomes an understatement. Although the need to include budget and finance for climate change is urgent, we cannot lose the direction in the long-term work to combat climate change. Good governance requires credible and trustworthy institutions built on principles of transparency and accountability. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, providing the foundation for intergovernmental action to combat climate change, recognize that the trust by individuals, transparency and accountability are the basis in order to protect the climate for present and future generations. Transparency International, that you might be familiar with, claims that the climate crisis is the biggest global challenge we have ever faced, and that the cost of responding to it, adapting to and mitigating are immense. Transparency International also underlines that the huge financial investments create tempting opportunities for corruption in And the international funding for environmental protection, climate change adaptation and mitigation is set to reach over $100 billion by the year 2020, and much more will be spent through domestic budgets. The urgency to act and not to lose course includes taking gender into consideration, and I really hope that you will attend the workshop on Thursday, because there is a direct relationship between gender equality, women's empowerment and climate change. On the one hand, women are disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of climate change. On the other hand, women have special knowledge and skills that can help make the response to climate change more effective and sustainable. And we believe that climate change policies must consider gender-based vulnerabilities and the contribution that women can make. But it could also be a way to advance gender equality and women's empowerment while fighting climate change. Women's political participation has resulted in greater responsiveness to citizens' needs, often increasing cooperation across party and ethnic lines and delivering more sustainable peace. At the local level, women's leadership has often led to improved outcomes of climate-related projects and policies. And it has also been seen that if policies and projects are implemented without women's meaningful participation, it can increase existing inequalities and decrease efficiency. To achieve the Paris Agreement, all actors in society must work together to reduce emissions. Collaboration between governments, business, and civil society is key. And the Inclusive Budgeting and Financing for Climate in Africa, Climate Change in Africa program supports stronger links between climate change policy, gender, and the budget process. Working closely with ministries of finance across Africa, the program provides support for the mobilization of the wider national and local budgetary process. Sweden is proud to support not only this program, but also other, for example, the delivering climate resilient development policies in Africa, implemented by the African Climate Policy Center at UNECA here in Addis Ababa. We are supporting the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA, and the ClimDev Special Fund that is administered by African Development Bank. And representing Sweden, I must also boast a little bit that Sweden is proud to be one of the largest contributors to climate financing globally, and the largest per capita donor to the climate funds. So the accelerated action is needed to align global financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Climate action needs to be firmly anchored in national budget and planning processes, both to ensure financing through national budgets and consistency between climate action and national implementation of the 2030 agenda. At the same time, national budgets are simply not large enough to finance costs of the transition and implementation of the Paris Agreement. Consequently, regulatory frameworks need to facilitate national resource mobilization for climate action. Greta Thunberg, who is the young Swedish climate activist, has, through her manifestations on Fridays for Future, emphasized to the whole world that there is an urgency to act. She has given voice to her generation against climate action, the young generation who stand to be most negatively impacted. I strongly believe that what you will be discussing during these coming days strengthening climate budgeting reforms, transparency and accountability, and also the gender issues is very urgent. And I hope that you will feel the urgency to act in your respective capacities to protect our climate for present and future generations. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ulla, for reminding us of the urgency of the problem. It actually makes me think back to our last peer learning and exchange event, where we had, one of Africa's young advocates, sharing more about the work that she's doing in the Lake Chad area. Her name was Ndc Targets. So thank you for that, and also for sharing more about the work that CEDA is doing in supporting the integration of gender and climate into international budgets. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first session. I'm pleased to introduce Excellent Hachileke from UNDP. Excellent has been working closely on Component B, and I'm sure he has been in contact with many of you as he's co-organized this event with us. And he's going to be sharing more about the climate expenditure reviews and budget tagging. So Excellent, over to you to lead the session.
Thank you very much, Shanice. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. We are very pleased to have you on board. I'll be facilitating session 1 of this workshop, which is looking at climate expenditure reviews and the budget tagging. As we all are aware, the impact of climate change on livelihoods, on people, on ecosystems and the economies cannot be overemphasized. Climate change, indeed, at the moment is one of the biggest challenges the world is facing in terms of reducing poverty and achieving sustainable development goals. We also are aware that climate change action takes place in various sectors of the economy, because climate change itself is not a sector per se. And on average, we find that there are very few projects that are developed or implemented with the sole purpose of addressing climate change. Otherwise, most of the projects that deal with climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, are within the key sectors of the economy. And that's why we think it's very critical and important that climate change is integrated and mainstreamed into public financial management systems and the budgeting arrangements and processes at the national and subnational level. And hence the importance of this session that we are looking at, because countries have developed a number of approaches and innovative tools for integrating climate change into the main economic sectors through budgeting and planning. In this session, we are going to have 2 presentations, one on climate public expenditure institutional review, a case of the second CPIR for Ghana, which is going to be presented by our colleague, Professor Lloyd Mensah, a financial economist at the University of Ghana. And then this will be followed by a presentation by Rutha Rukira, a consultant who has supported Namibia to do a feasibility study on the viability of implementing a CBT on Namibia's fiscus. This will then be followed by a reaction by a discussant. In this case, we have the privilege of having Silke van Vanden. She is a public economics specialist from the World Bank. That then will be followed by questions and answers and a discussion. So without much ado, can I take now this opportunity to invite Professor Rod to give our first presentation, which is on the second CPIR of Ghana. Over to you, Professor.
All right, thank you very much, sir. Sorry for joining late. I didn't come on board early, but then the introduction gives me a direction of the intention of the entire program, which I'm happy to be part of it. Right, so basically, we're looking at, I think the slides has been shared, right? Or you want me to share it from my end? Okay, so I can see the slides. Can you see the slides and everything else from your end?
Yes, we can see the slides from our side.
Yeah, sure.
Right, so this is a bit of background to this exercise. This is a second CPR, which is Climate, Public Expenditure and Institutional Review. And basically, it is an exercise that looks at how climate financing is tracked all the way from the government level and different agencies under the government. And then the institutions that are supporting this climate change expenditure, at the same time, looking at the policies that are supporting it. So we are basically looking at three pillars here. That is, there was a first one that was done before 2015, and the UNDP commissioned this, somewhere for us to look at the institutional reforms that has taken place, the policies that have been implemented, and then also the expenditure, over the last 5 years. And basically, that is the exercise that we did, and we can say that. So if you can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so the objective, like I said, we are looking at three pillars, is to review expenditure on activities that are related to climate change and to assess the extent to which this expenditure is supported by existing policies and institutional responsibilities over the years. So if you take out the three pillars, you realize that we're talking about expenditure review, talking about policy review, and then at the same time, looking at the institutions that are supporting these policies and then the expenditures that are related to climate change. Next, please. Next slide, please. Right, so here we adapted a methodology which the emphasis is on the triangulation, which we look at desktop review, did a bit of quantitative and some qualitative approaches in ascertaining the exercise that has been given to us, that was given to us by UNDP. And so we look at three main features of national funding on climate change actions. So a detailed assessment of existing national and sectorial policy priorities and strategies that relate to climate change. And then we did a systematic review of institutional arrangement for promoting this, the integration of climate change policy priorities into budgeting and expenditure management. And then a review of the integration of climate change objectives within the budgeting processes, including as part of budget planning, implementation, expenditure management, and financing in the country. So we looked at how climate change expenditure is integrated to the mainframe budget of the country. And then the CPR was conducted at a national level where the representative institutions, mostly we're looking at the MEST, we're looking at EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, some agencies and the government. And then we're looking at the Forestry Commission, which is under the Ministry of Natural Resources. And so effectively, those are the things. And then we go down to a bit to MMDAs, which at their level looked at a number of MDAs which are prone to climate change. We're going to focus on as well. Next, please. So per the policy arrangement, Ghana is fortunate to have a program called Coordinated Program of Economic and Social Policies, which is a government main driver of development. and is built on pillars of economic development, social development, environment, infrastructure, and human settlement, among others. This program, demonstrates the relevance and commitment of the country to respond to, challenges and opportunities offered by climate change. So it has several pillars, and the pillars are that one, safeguarding the natural environment and ensuring a resilient built environment, maintaining a stable and united and safe country, and then building, a prosperous country. So this program therefore advocates the adoption of development strategies that are growth-focused, people-centered, and delivers, climate-proof outcomes. So we are fortunate to have a policy of that nature that more or less adapt climate change in national, development and economic management as well. The next one, please. So we have sectors, different sectors, and how policies that have been rolled out over the years in the country. And you can see we have national, change policy, climate change policy that came up in 2013. We have national energy policy. We have national environmental policy. We have the forest and wildlife policy. We have national transport policy, the Ghana Red Plus, Ghana National Low Carbon Development Strategy, Renewable Energy Act 2011, and then we have Renewable Energy Master Plan 2019, Food and Agriculture Sector Development Policy. These are all policies that, have been designed by the country to give kind of a direction and focus when it comes to climate change related activities. And so effectively, those are not exhaustive anyway. It's just a matrix that I created, to pick some few ones to put them in there to indicate that we have policies in-house that are guiding us when it comes to climate change related activities. Next slide, please. So we looked at the institutional architecture of the country, under the institutional analysis, and look at climate change and institutional architecture. And you realize that the climate change activities is recognized all the way up to, the office of the president, where under the office of the president, we have parliament, and within parliament, Ministry of Finance and Ministry of other sectors that are under Ministry of Finance. We have NDPC, National Development Planning Commission. So you could see that climate change is integrated in our national development planning as well. And then we have one of the main ministries sitting at the right-hand side, which is the MEST, Ministry of Environmental Science and Technology. And then an agency under the MEST is Environmental Protection Agency. Those are key highlight focused ministry that we think are more deep into climate related activity. Not to say other ministries are not part of it. So if you look at the NDPC, most of the ministries have their development, aligned to the National Development Planning Commission's agenda. And effectively, all these are things that, are climate related, and it sync all the way down to the apex of the institutional structures we have in the country. And then we have the Ghana Statistical Service, which also plays a major role. We have academia, and then the private sector, CSOs also playing a major role. Under the ministries, we have the Regional Coordinating Council, and then the MMDAs, that is the local level administration, also recognizing, climate change related activities and, influence decision making. And most of the agencies at that local level are more implementing agencies. And so they seem also to recognize climate change related activities. So basically, this is just a summary of Ghana's climate change institutional architecture, which if you look at the ministries, department, and agencies, they comprises of all the ministries that we have in the country, which, I mean, climate change activities, you know, also are in sync with. The next slide, please. So we have the National Climate Change Steering Committee, for which is made up of three, you know, pillars. And basically, we're looking at the composition of the committee, which is made up of the representative from the government ministries, government and agencies, parliamentarians, civil society organizations, academia, research institutions, the private sector, and development partners. And then we have the National Climate Change Steering Committee, which is mandated with seeing to the day-to-day management of national adaptation strategy, giving policy direction on climate change at the national level. And the committee is also responsible for preparation of, you know, guidelines, supervising and monitoring, and the monitoring and evaluation of programs, projects on climate change. So the committee is also tasked with, you know, supporting local institutions in capacity building and approval of program project, and recommend same for, you know, funding. Next one, please. So the government institutions, which we try to zoom out from the architecture that we gave, some of them you can see from here: Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Roads and Highways, National Development Planning Commission, which is a commission on its own, you know, ensuring that, you know, the government's development plans, projections are all in line. But then if it is climate related, it also comes out down to the other ministries. And then we have Ministry of Interior. Someone who asked, what is Ministry of Interior? Has to do with what do we call it, climate change related activities. Ministry of Interior has an agency which we call them NADMO, that is a National Disaster kind of response agency, and anything that has to do with climate change related, that goes with emergency, they respond to it. And so we feel Ministry of Interior could be part of the government institutions that support climate change. And then the Ministry of Environment and Science, which is neck deep into these climate related activities. And clearly, that's the main ministry. And then also the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, for which we understand basically that this government over the past few years has been aligning, you know, climate change to agriculture, which for me, they are playing a major role in that regard. I mean, as far as Ghana is concerned. And then the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection. We know the vulnerabilities, those who are well exposed when it comes to climate change. So we have a ministry. And in fact, a lot of funds goes into that ministry as far as this current administration is concerned. So we'll be looking at the expenditure side of the various ministries as well as we go on. Next slide, please. So government institutions continued. Okay, so the NADMO that I mentioned earlier, and then we have the National Development Agencies and MMDAs, feeder roads. They are all part of the institutions that are aligned to climate change related activities in the country. Next slide, please. So here, I think for presentation purposes, I think we skipped so many things. So some of the conclusions and the recommendations are things that we did. And we felt like, I mean, as a government, they must look at, you know, those things that can enhance the institutional structures and then the various policies that we have. So we came up by saying that an effective institutional response to climate change requires strong coordination between the various implementation agencies. And those are the agencies that I listed up there. So though these institutions have been instrumental in implementation and achievement of climate change objectives, there still exists kind of a challenge when it comes to coordination and harmonization necessary for effective actions on climate change among these institutions. And so though the country is implementing a decentralized system of governance, the lack of an effective coordination system is impacting on the delivery of their mandate. So MDAs and MMDAs are not strengthened enough to respond effectively to climate change. So they seem to be operating in silos, and that coordination is not that clear when it comes to institutional arrangement, and then also, policies that runs across. Apart from the national umbrella policies, you don't see an institutional specific policy that is climate, aligned. And then the capacity of these institutions in mobilization of resources, implementation of projects and programs on climate change and coordinations needs to improve to ensure programs and projects implementation. The next slide, please. So we recommend that MDAs need to be proactive in assessing funds, but need to strengthen their collaboration with the right agencies to be able to tap the many opportunities that exist in climate change subsector. And then the NDPC, which has been at the forefront of providing capacity building for MMDAs in the area of climate change, such as program design and implementation, mainstreaming climate change in their development plans, budgeting, among others, is devising a tool to assist the MMDAs to be able to design programs on climate change. It is, however, recommended that the MMDAs become more proactive. I mean, if you go down further, the exercise we did, if you go down the MMDAs, you see, I mean, most of them are.
Sorry, we're having a lot of difficulties hearing you.
Come again?
We're having difficulties hearing you. The audio's breaking up.
My audio is breaking. Okay, maybe it's the internet stability, I think.
You're clear now.
It's clear now. Okay, then, right, that's fine. So effectively, if you go down the MMDAs, the level, you get to understand that most of them seem to have know-how on climate change, activities, and they've been trained on it. But then sometime after the training, the agencies that's training don't really follow up, to see whether the training has, is making impact or not. Those are the things we think we will need in the system to ensure that every now and then there's a follow-up after training to check whether the knowledge that was impacted is really helping, to achieve whatever objectives they stand for. So though trainings are provided to MMDAs, the problem is usually the late delivery of those training programs. It is recommended that the NDPC develop a RISE schedule in collaboration with the MMDAs to understand not just what they need, but also when they need those trainings. So the timing of the training is important. So in addition to the NDPC needs, to collaborate with the Ministry of Finance in designing the training MMDAs on issues relating to climate change. And then the fourth one, we looked at duplication of effort in climate space limits the number of broad project areas that can be financed. It is therefore recommended that climate change coordinating institutions devise a mechanism where they can harmonize all projects on climate change to ensure an even funding of programs. So when you go down to the mini MDAs and MMDAs, clearly you will see that most of them are doing projects that are climate related. But then if you come to the apex, I mean, maybe at the Ministry of Finance and REC unit, and you ask them, what is the matrix of projects that are ongoing and that are related to climate change? I mean, they find it difficult to really come out with, a structure in the entire country. So it's like everything is being done, in different, environment, and they are climate change, but they are not being captured. So it is further recommended that, legislation to back the tracking tool to be developed as soon as possible to ensure compliance, so that we can have, did I hear Excellent telling me that I should conclude? Okay, next one, please. Yes, kindly conclude. Okay, so from here, I was coming to the expenditure part of the analysis, the 3 pillars, which basically we look at identifying different, expenditures that are related to climate change. And effectively, we came up with, and when we say expenditure, we're looking at expenditure that conforms to the climate, manual, action manual for sector officers. And then we're looking at those that conforms to the budget code fact sheet from the Ministry of Finance. And then international expenditures that are subject to the budget code, and then they are in line with climate change are also captured in here. And basically, can we go to the next one, please? So we came up, different expenditures, and looking at the component of those expenditures, you can see clearly that we can have high, medium, and low component of expenditure, and that depends on the quantum or the weight of the expenditure that is going into climate-related activities. And so we can have a project that have only 20% expenditure that is going into climate change, and that becomes a low kind of a category of climate expenditure in Ghana. And can you go to so when we say expenditure, it must conform to all these three. Can you go to the next one, please? And so if you look at that from 2015, you can see clearly that is the pattern of climate change expenditure related to the total government of Ghana expenditure, and in terms of as a percentage. So on the average, it's about 3.93% of the total government expenditure that goes into climate relevant actions. Can you go on to the next one, please? We go down to the various ministries, and clearly the government focus reflects focus of expenditure when it comes to climate change related activities, reflect in the various expenditure to the ministry's total expenditure in this structure. And you can see the Ministry of Fisheries and Aquaculture has been spending a lot of climate-related, of their total expenditure in climate-related activities. Some are basically on capacity building and all those. And the Ministry of Agriculture is one of the exceptions, and MESTI is also in there. You can see clearly the Ministry of Gender and Children Social Protection also spending around, in the recent years, around 93% of their total expenditure being climate related. But most of those ones are more into the low categorized climate related, expenditures. Can you go to the next one, please? So comparing the climate expenditure to, Ghana has National Climate Change Policy, which we set target in 2015 to, complete a certain kind of goal in 2020. And we felt this exercise falls in line with that. And so we related the expenditures, climate expenditure that has been done that in the past, and then related to, what was projected. And clearly, can you go to the next one? It gives us the various categorizations, and you can see that climate change and migration has, spent more than what was budgeted. So this structure gives us the idea that the policy focus has been, overweighted into certain, areas. And so in terms of expenditure, so our advice is that government should try to find a way to ensure that there will be equal, almost equal distribution of expenditure as far as climate related, expenditure is concerned in this, NCCP focus. Can we go to the next one, please? So we conclude, we can skip this part. This is just an addition of new codes that we find that we think it was in line. So the key take home here was that Ghana has committed an average of about 3.94% of its total expenditure to climate change. Now, if you relate this to, the last 5 years, climate expenditure, you realize that last 5 years, we couldn't do up to about 2% of what, is earmarked as climate change to total government expenditure. So we can see improvement. And what do we attribute this improvement to? Is it awareness of the people at the ministries, and then also at the MMD, the training that has been ongoing that is helping them to categorize their expenditure, therefore captured by the public financial management system that we have in tracking our expenditure in this country. So basically, that is what we have, come up with in this exercise. Can we go to the recommendations? So that's the take home here. Pick up 1 or 2 recommendations, and then I think I will conclude as Excellent is requesting for the next one, please. Right. So going forward, what do we say? There's a need for government to set climate expenditure targets at the MMD. So now, as we speak, we look at performance in aggregation, but then we don't we can't find the performance at the ministries and then the MMDA level on climate expenditure. So the relativities has been on capturing it related to the agencies or the ministry's total expenditure. But however, do we have target for those ministries and all those units? And if you look at the table clearly, Ministry of Finance did not exhibit any climate change, but then it has a unit, which is the NREC unit, for which their core mandate is to look at climate change related activities. And so what about the expenditure that goes into that particular unit at the Ministry of Finance? Nothing was captured in the system they have to track climate change related activities. Can we go on to the next one, please? So I think that is what basically, so with the differentials in the NCCP policy budget allocations over the years, calls for more equitable allocations going forward. So basically, that is what we have done in the past. There's 5 months that we were engaged by the UNDP on this exercise. Thank you very much for giving me your ears. I think we are open.
Thank you so much, Professor Rod. Without wasting much time, I'll now call upon our colleague, Rutha Rukira from Integral Water Solutions, Namibia, to give us a presentation on climate expenditure tagging. We'll have, please hold on to your questions. We'll have a session after the discussant has reacted to the 2 presentations. For now, may I call upon over to you. Ruth, are you there?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting us to this very important workshop. My name is Luther Okira. I'm an independent consultant. I'm basically presenting this on behalf of the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism in Namibia and the UNDP office in Namibia. I take it that according to the program, we have about 25 minutes. Is that correct? Do I then have 15 minutes or so, or what is
you have about 10 to 15 minutes, 15 max. If you can do it in minutes, all the better.
Thank you very much. All right, my name is Luther, as I said, and I'm a hydrologist by training. My colleague who worked with me on this project is a chartered accountant, but he couldn't be here today. Could we proceed, please? Next slide, please. All right, basically those would be my talking points today. A brief introduction of the CPT project in Namibia. Some decisions the Namibian government has had to consider in the CPT development in Namibia, and some high-level architecture of the CPT model. Hopefully we'll have a time to look at the technical design and then the implementation design. Basically, our approach here was very, very detailed in a very, very short while, because we were given this assignment in December, which coincided with the national recession, or the, as we call it, Namibia goes on holiday until basically February. So we concentrated a lot on how we could implement this, and that is what I will then elaborate on. And next one. All right. The objective of the study was to conduct a feasibility study to determine the viability of CBT in Namibia. The scope was to identify the scope, the criteria, and methodological approaches for implementing the CBT in Namibia based on the best international practices, and to develop the model for classification, as well as validate the proposed CBT model, and then submit a final report. The next one. Those are the deliverables. I don't think we have to elaborate a lot on them. We had to present an inception report and the final report. We presented and validated this through a workshop. And then we presented a final report with a proposed budget taking model in Namibia. The sixth part didn't really take place because of time constraints, and we're hoping that training would be part of the next phase of the project. Next one. Now, in analyzing or determining the viability of this project in Namibia, we needed to, or government needed to consider whether they would be taking the actual expenditure or the budget at the budget process, whether it's a recurrent budget or development budget that is of interest, whether the process should be centralized or decentralized, and whether the externally funded activities should also be tagged. And again, whether this is at central government, at local, regional, or at state-owned enterprises level. And then what about the private entities that also spend a lot of money in the development space, such as non-governmental organizations? How do we standardize so that we match the international reporting formats? At what vote or economic level or program level or activity level? Would this taking be automated or a manual system? Who will take, and what reports need to produce? These are some of the issues for consideration to the entity that is developing the CBT in Namibia. Next one. All right, I'm preaching to the experts here, so I will not go into the details of what is CBT, but basically is flecking the expenditure that goes into climate change, whether that is now mitigation or adaptation. We also, as I think it was mentioned by other speakers here, budget taking is actually happening already in some areas, especially here in Namibia. I think the gender issues, as well as the specific program called the Harabe Prosperity Plan, where government is actually able to take and then know what was the level of expenditure in certain areas of interest. The purpose of the CBT is to support, ultimately to support mobilization of additional external financing by identifying the funding gap regularly and demonstrating government commitment and co-financing of programs relating to climate change. In the development of the proposal for CBT, the option should enable and facilitate mobilization of resources for climate change management. If we can proceed to the next slide, please. The generic model obviously talks about the purpose, key objectives, the CBT, and its relationship with the climate change objectives, the architecture of the CBT model, the technical design, and the implementation design. Now, on the technical design, one looks at what is climate change relevant expenditure? How do you classify that? And how does this climate change relevant expenditure interact with the public financial management system? On the implementation, it's basically the modalities, the procedures, the role classification, the role clarification, as well as the format of reporting, and so forth. Next one, please. Namibia also has the national climate change policy. Hello, is someone asking me? Should I proceed?
Please proceed. I think somebody did not mute their mic. Proceed, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent. The purpose of CBG, as you said, is to provide secure and adequate funding resources for effective adaptation and mitigation investments or interventions, to enhance capacities and synergies at local, regional, and national levels, to integrate climate change effectively into policies, institutional and development frameworks, to develop action and strategies for climate change mitigation, and to develop and implement appropriate adaptation strategies and actions that will lower the vulnerability of Namibia to climate change. And next one, please. Now, the architecture of the public finance management system and the CBID model should look at the State Finance Act and Treasury rules, should look at the roles and responsibilities for CBD and budgeting process within these institutions, should look at the budget approach, should look at the budget and account code structure, the IT systems at national level, the public finance management at sub-national level, the SOE, state-owned enterprises and enterprise and donor-funded climate change expenditure. My apology for some of the acronyms, but they are all within the report. So, but as I go, I would always try to elaborate what they stand for. Next one, please. Now, in trying to share with you our experience on this very short project or short duration project, we try to discern some principles that should be guiding this process. And the first one is climate change relevant expenditure. And in determining climate change relevant expenditure, one should go back to the National Climate Change Policy and look at the strategic focus areas within that policy. One should define what is climate change expenditure. One needs to assess and decide on the budget measures to be taken. Develop a classification system for expenditure, and identify the outputs or information needs that are expected from CBT. The classification methodology, which is the second guideline principle, should relate and match the international classifications so as to make it feasible for country-to-country comparisons. Thirdly, there should be weights assigned to the climate change expenditure. And I think it flows over to the next slide, please. So that one knows what is a weight that is in the budget process that is prioritizing climate change interventions. The extent to which the CBT would interact with the public finance management system, and one should look at, in this case, the chart of accounts, which should be abbreviated COA hereafter. The level of automation of the budget process and financial management system within the country, linking the budget to actual expenditure, and linking to the sources of funding, including external sources. Now, in Namibia, the operational budgets are done within Excel and then uploaded into the PFM. NPC, or the National Planning Commission, that is responsible for the capital budget, uses a database for managing the capital budget. The operational budget is done by the Ministry of Finance. And then the Ministry of Finance then consolidates this system, these sources of budget or types of budgets into the financial management system that is organized around cost of accounts. I think I've touched on this one. At the moment, there is no link between central government system, central government budget system, and the subnational government financial systems. I think that is a weakness that we identified. Fortunately, all the entities within the public sector have the same year end. That is the 1st of March to the 28th of February or 29th of February. The next one, please. The next question is, who gave us the data? Who takes, basically? Is it the experts that are assigned, the line ministries, or a combination? And the taking procedures should ideally happen during the planning phase of the budgeting process. But the question is that the only way, or should it be done after the budget has been put into the system? And what is the taking, and how about taking the expenditure? We'll come to that in a slide or two further. Who should do the validation of the CBT? Ideally, that should be the Office of the Auditor General, because that will be an independent party to the Ministry of Finance or to the line ministries. Should it be an Auditor General or also some peer review mechanism? The format of the reporting should be determined and should be linked to the national climate change objectives or priority areas, and also should incorporate the needs of the recipients of the information. And then we need to have a clear role clarification as to who does what in this whole process, who takes, who reports, who's a custodian, who implements. Next one, please. I think that is what I just spoke about. The custodian should be, in our opinion, the MEFT, the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism. The implementation agency should be the Ministry of Finance. We should look at the basis of identifying, the climate change expenditure. The taking procedure must be designed, and how do we validate it, how do we report? Can we look at the next one, please? Now, this is what we proposed in a design. The identification of climate change relevant expenditure should be done by line ministries when they identify and propose the expenditure through the PIFs and the MOFs, project identification forms and so on, because the line ministries are the experts and they would know and be able to tell whether this is climate change relevant, this expenditure is climate change relevant, and whether this is for mitigation or for adaptation or for both. The classification of the expenditure, climate change relevant expenditure, should be done by MEFT, assisted by line ministries. Again, MEFT is the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism. The weighing or attaching the weights to the to the climate change relevant expenditure should be done by MEFT again. When should the taking be done? During the initial phases of the budget process. And who validates the tax? The validation should be done by MOF in line with the line ministries. Next one, please. Now, this is a technical proposal. I don't know whether it is relevant here, but basically this is the architecture of the Namibian finance PFM, where you organize the expenditure according to votes, and on the left-hand side are the codes. All three is everywhere the same. So you have a vote, and you have a main division, and you have the program or sub-program or activity. You have a subdivision. You have an item. You have project codes, a cost center, and the reporting entity. So this whole codes is 03/220/02 and so forth. Why we are raising this is where at the end we proposed to append a code, a new code within the system that will then we'll come to that one, but that will then flag or tag physically the expenditure and indicate whether that expenditure is climate, whether that climate change relevant expenditure is for adaptation or for mitigation or for both. Next one, please. And this is what we proposed to be appended to the code, as I just explained. The expenditure is either climate relevant or not climate relevant. If it is climate relevant, you take it with a 1. If not, you take it with a 0. Stroke, the next code is the expenditure of the climate change relevant expenditure, adaptation or mitigation. If mitigation, 2. If adaptation, you choose, you select the 1, probably through a drop-down kind of selection. And then the next code, then is it highly relevant or relevant or neutral? And then a strategic focus area, which one will then pick from the national climate change policy. So I think this is probably the essence or the crux of our assignment, was to propose how do we do that physically and technically. And I can just repeat this quickly. We on the code architecture that is on the previous page, you add then 4 codes, and these codes are first to determine whether the expenditure is climate change relevant or not. 2, whether it is for adaptation or mitigation. 3, how relevant it is on a scale of neutral to or weak to relevant to highly relevant, and then somehow insert in a comment that or select then from a drop-down selection what strategic focus area or more it addresses. The strategic focus areas as identified by the national climate change policy. All right, I think we can then proceed. We should be nearing conclusion now. So again, that is now the final codes. So usually the code is 03/20. 20 is an example of a code, could be 21 or 05 or whatever, and that's so it goes. And then you add these other codes at the end, which is an example showing a highly climate change relevant expenditure for adaptation on the strategic focus area of vulnerable groups. Sorry for the logo that is within there. So seeing something like that would then identify or would then indicate that this expenditure, the specific expenditure on that vote, on that main division, on that item or project or whatever is climate change relevant. And when one draws your reports, when one then draw your reports, the report will also classify that expenditure as highly, as climate change relevant. And I think that is a purpose so that one can then start to understand what is expenditure on climate change, including all from state-funded expenditure, or donor-funded, or grants, whatever the source is, which then will aid Namibia in reporting to the international fora what our climate change focus is. Next one, please. Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was what I needed to present to you, and this was presented to the MF and UNDP, and the report still in draft form is still to follow the procedures within the MF and the UNDP in Namibia to finalize, but the report is for the excellent. And if there are queries, we can entertain them. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Gusa, for that very elaborate presentation. May I just ask colleagues to mute their mics? There are some noises coming from a few individuals. I can see them, but I'm not able to mute them. So please, if you can mute your mics. We are now going to ask our colleague from the World Bank, Silke von Den. She is a public sector economist from the World Bank to give us some reactions or reflections on the two presentations, and then we'll open it up for questions, clarifications. Over to you, Silke. Please, Hitha, can you mute your mic? Thank you. Silke, over to you.
Thank you so much. Excellent. I hope you can hear me.
Very clear and loud.
Fantastic. Many thanks to the entire team for inviting us. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be able to join this session. And I very much enjoyed following both presentations, which were very well done. So thank you for that. Starting with the Ghana CPR, again, I commend the team. I had the opportunity to do several CPRs at the bank too, and PRs before. So I think the CPR it's a very challenging exercise. And the fact that you were able to do this in 5 months is amazing. I think in terms of the key messages that came well through the presentation, I just would like to maybe point to a few points. The first thing is that I appreciate that the focus is done, or the effort is put on trying to align the budget to the policy, in particular the NCCP. Even if it's more an outdated version from 2013, I think it's always important when you do this type of budget exercise to make sure you link it to the existing policies, which is the NCCP. On the institutional arrangement, I very much liked the chart that was presented. It was very clear. And I think the only thing I would be able to add here is that as in many countries, the devil is in the detail, as we say. So while on the screen or on paper, it always looks good. The question is then, as you had also said in your recommendations, that the question is how effective are actually these institutions? How strong is the coordination? And you already mentioned that the coordination is a challenge. It is critical because these the governance arrangement that is in place is responsible for basically government's response to render the infrastructure more resilient or to have more climate-proof investments. And in order to have this, there needs to be good mechanisms in place to collect data on climate hazards, to channel these to the planning and budgeting entities, and to include this in the design and during the implementation to make sure there is enough operation and maintenance funding given to it, etc., etc. There needs to be adequate appraisals in place that capture this. So these type of details are often not yet in place and require a second review, which obviously with a limited time you had available, that would be probably a kind of follow-up that I would recommend. In this respect also, I think you proposed already that it would be critical to have some tools. I would say the focus should be probably not on additional tools, but look at the tools that are already in place. For example, at the Ministry of Finance in Ghana, I understand that they're currently preparing a project concept note guidelines for the MDAs. So that's an entry point where climate change can be captured. The appraisal guidelines are prepared. Again, there's no entry point. On the ex post review of investments, guidelines are prepared. So there are templates that are already in place or are being reviewed where it's worth it to review them and integrate them, climate change considerations there. One other thing then on the results, the tagging results, which is similar to what we have seen in several of our countries also. It is still low, but as you had said also, it has increased, which you have attributed to an increase in the awareness of the MDAs. Maybe one might want to take a look also, because there seems to be a tendency, investment budgets normally also increase. And given that most of the tagging takes place at the investment budget, so that might be also a bit of a bias that if the investment gets out, you might also tag more, or I think it's worth it to take a second look also if there's not a slight risk sometimes also of a bit of greenwashing. The more excitement and mobilization is there about climate change, the more MDAs tend to also tag more on climate change, even if it's not really climate change relevant. So again, important is that eventually, and this is unfortunately something where I think we still all need to work on, even though we put a lot of focus on the climate change budget tagging. First of all, most of this tagging ends up being at the appropriation level. And then second of it, to really influence the design of the programs and the allocations is still quite a challenge, and requires additional work and training and follow-up. I think maybe one thing that might be also useful is, and maybe it was presented, I didn't see it, but to distinguish also between external and domestic funding. In many countries, climate change agenda is still dominated by the external funding, which has gone down through the pandemic. So you have the countries that, facing a very tight fiscal setting. So the pressure is on the domestic resources, and the few resources you have, maybe the message we want to give to the countries is the few resources, how can you use them efficiently? So again, the focus is on the tagging, do good, adequate tagging. I very much was interested in the table you saw where you listed all the MDAs and over the years how some have tagged better. It might be helpful for MDAs to see what are some of the challenges in doing tagging. Because as easy as this table looks like, to put this together must have been a very hard work, because you need a lot of detailed expenditures to be sure that this is climate relevant. Very often climate change expenditures are embedded in programs. So I know you have the weighing approach, but it's not always easy to exactly know, if you in particular only have an economic classification, to see what is climate relevant. Sometimes you have adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation in one expenditure is difficult to distinguish between this all. So there are a range of challenges that are useful also to bring out and to learn from, and to see how this can be improved. And my last message, I think, which it's one thing we always, I think one colleague of us once said, we all get carried away by the counting of the green beans, which is true, because at the end, what do we do with this information? Even if we did some over-tagging and under-tagging, it's very, very important to make use of this information. And it's very rare that we see in countries that they were able to use this information and inform back the strategic planning of programs and projects. In Nigeria right now, we're doing climate change budget tagging with the states. We started with the states, not at the federal level, with the states. So we try to do it as simple and easy. And they have citizen budgets in place. And they've been starting to publish it there. In the next step, we're trying to have an annex in the budget where the information will be published, even if it's not yet accurate, but to make use of it, publish it, and see how decision makers can actually use this information. This was on the CPR, and excellent if you give me 1 more minute, if I have this. Do I have 1 more minute?
Yes, please, just 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. I very much enjoyed also listening to the feasibility, basically the structure of the CBT that will be introduced in Namibia. I think when we started, I can see you've done all the groundwork with the definition, the scope, and the classification. What we have done typically is that we do carry out CCBT on a pilot basis with a few sectors, and then it will be rolled out. And from these pilot sectors, you can draw lessons with the methodology, the MDAs, did it work, where were the challenges, and then you can roll it out to more states. That might be more of an effective rollout, but maybe you've thought about this already. And again, here also very important, make sure that in the methodology, you use this information, find entry points through attaching the information to the budget, very simple citizen budget, if this is available in Namibia, it will make a big difference, and it gives also a better incentive to the MDAs to do it. On the weighing, I think it would be beneficial to have maybe also discussion. Weighing comes with advantages and with disadvantages. Advantages, definitely you're able to zoom in better and have about an estimate of the climate action that is embedded in a program. On the other hand, it makes it a bit more cumbersome for the planners that they have to think about it. So often we have opted to just tag. You have the investment budget, you go through the different projects and you just tag. You risk to overtag, you risk to undertag. But you're hoping that over time, when you improve the design of your project, that your tagging results become also more accurate. So I'm not against it. I'm just saying that there are different methodologies, and again, it might be good to have I think in Namibia, I was wondering, in Uganda, they had program budgeting, and I think Namibia has also introduced it. So one way in Uganda, we tagged at the output level. You can do the sub-program or the output level, which also gives you a good level of accuracy of detail that you need for the tagging. So just to think, I very much liked also that you want to introduce the validation, very important. It's often forgotten when you do the CCBT. So yeah, so this is in the bulk. Again, I very much enjoyed the presentation. It was very inspiring. Thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Thank you so much, Silke, for very insightful contributions. Colleagues, we are supposed to have questions, but we've run out of time. I've asked colleagues to write any questions in the chat box, and then the presenters will be able to provide feedback. We are actually 4 minutes into the next session, which is session 2, which means basically we have also swallowed the 10 minutes break time that we are supposed to have between session 1 and 2. So I'll now hand over to Shanaz to take us either to a short break or into this second session of this workshop. Over to you, Shanaz, and thank you so much to the presenters and the Silke for your contribution to making this session 1 a success. We'll be able to summarize the points out of it and able to share with the rest of the colleagues who are participating in this workshop. Over to you, Shanaz. Thank you so much.
Thank you, excellent. And thank you to all the presenters and the discussants for those valuable insights. So we are running behind. Unfortunately, we have to cut the break. So we can take a very quick 3-minute break. I know it's not long, but let's be back at 11:35 and hopefully we can catch up with the time in the other sessions. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everybody from the very, very short break. I'm now going to introduce us to session 2, and this is on climate financing frameworks at national and local levels. Facilitating this session is Zolani Zonyane. He is a technical advisor on public finance management at GIZ, and Zolani also serves on the advisory board to the program. So Zolani, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Shanaz, and greetings to everyone from all corners of the world. I'll be brief in trying to introduce the session for the interest of time. One thing that I can say, we can really talk about budgeting for climate change. We can talk about expenditure. We can talk about incorporating gender to climate change. But what is important is financing, because all of these three that I've mentioned could probably count to naught if we don't address the issue of financing. Taking us through this session in terms of the presentations, we will take firstly Cabo Verde in terms of financing frameworks, which will then be followed by Kenya. What will happen thereafter immediately, I'll allow our discussants from OECD and IMF to make their inputs. As I've indicated, and as we have seen from the previous session, time is a factor. I'll ask our presenters to at least limit their presentations to about 10 to 15 minutes and allow our discussants about 5 minutes for them to reflect on the presentations. In case of the questions to the audience, I will request you to post your questions in the chat so that after the discussants, our presenters can attend to the questions that will be made in the chat. Without really spending more time, let me hand over to our first presenter, which will be Christopher, assisted by the independent consultant, Louis. Over to you, colleagues.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, Chris, loud and clear.
Great. So yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me to give a brief presentation on Cabo Verde's efforts to integrate the NDC financing framework within its broader sustainable development financing strategy. Before I get into the details, I should just mention that we're still in the beginning stages of this integration process. And but this exercise in itself is already very helpful in terms of the way we're trying to conceptualize this and how to best move forward doing so. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So Cabo Verde, like all the other countries, has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it works within a variety of regional and global frameworks. Can we press the button? This is usually I'm in control of the presentation, so maybe just press it a few times. So working within the main global and regional frameworks, including the SDGs, but also notably the Addis Action Agenda and the Paris Agreement. And all of these frameworks have been filtered into Cabo Verde through a process that was launched last year in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic called Cabo Verde Ambition 2030, which is a very ambitious, as the name indicates, set of goals that Cabo Verde set for itself in order to meet its sustainable development targets aligned with these regional global frameworks. And what we're working on right now is identifying the appropriate sources of financing for this agenda over the next 10 years, or actually less now. For reasons that I'll explain now, in the Cabo Verdean context, it's particularly important that this includes a variety of financing options, including the more traditional public investments, as in government spending, revenues, and ODA, but crucially also blended and private forms of financing, which go from PPPs to FDI and sustainable impact investment. So next slide. So the reason why this is important for Cabo Verde is the high strains on public finance that derive from the high levels of public debt relative to GDP, which has been exacerbated by a number of crises that originated beyond the shores of Cabo Verde, but to which Cabo Verde was exposed. This began in the 2007-2008 period, shortly after Cabo Verde became a middle-income country through the Great Recession, continued through the EU sovereign debt crisis due to Cabo Verde's peg to the euro and very strong vulnerability to the European banking system, as well as more recently COVID-19, which induced a very significant spike in public debt relative to GDP, but not because Cabo Verde contracted more debt, but simply because GDP declined tremendously due to the abrupt break in tourism income and revenues. So let's go to the next slide. This is further exacerbated by the fact that also in terms of ODA, Cabo Verde's revenues or Cabo Verde's access to ODA has declined since it became a middle-income country in 2008. Even though there was an initial spike by a select number of donors, this has steadily decreased. So next slide. And so in order to identify alternative forms of financing, the INFF in Cabo Verde seeks to, another click, or 3 clicks perhaps, integrate policies that can combine a range of planning and financing policies that will be able to facilitate the financing of these goals through a wide variety of financing sources. So these range from public finance, including, as I mentioned earlier, revenue strategies and the annual and medium-term budgets and public debt management, but crucially also, let's say, non-traditional forms of development finance, and in particularly revenue-generating forms of investment that were through private sector growth and development. You can create revenues for the government that can be then invested through discretionary spending in things like climate change or SDGs, but also actions that are not taken by the government that can also be conducive to climate change. Here we're thinking about things like renewable energy or more sustainable forms of shipping, or other types of economic activity that have a double impact or double bottom line. There was actually a slide missing, but I can just recap it. So one of the challenges also in Cabo Verde in the context of this constrained financing landscape is the fact that the NDC calls for 2 billion euros in investment in incremental investment. So that's 2 billion euros beyond what there is right now over the next 10 years. And just to put that into some perspective, that would be a third of the 2020 annual government budget over the next 10 years, which is a tremendous amount of resources for a small island developing state. That in the context of high debt levels that I mentioned earlier. So next slide. So how do we get there? Well, there's four main mechanisms within the integrated national financing framework that are supposed to lead to a consolidated financing strategy and outcomes that will allow the country to meet its development objectives. These four building blocks are in the first instance, relevant assessments and diagnostics, which we're in this process right now in the context of what's called the development finance assessment, which identifies the general financing needs, the financing landscape, looks at relevant risks as well as policy and institutional constraints that can be addressed in order to facilitate financing flows in key sectors. In addition to this, the second block is the financing strategy, which is in Cabo Verde aligned with the strategic development plan, as well as the monitoring and review processes that allow for a governance and coordination mechanism involving relevant government ministries, private sector, public entities, civil society organizations, and relevant development partners to all come together within a coordination system, which I'll also go into more detail later because it's important for climate change as well. Next slide. So in Cabo Verde, and as you can already see, there's links to climate change throughout the main what we call Sdg Accelerators. There was a UN MAPS mission in 2019 that used a rapid integrated assessment to identify 5 major Sdg accelerators that would have a transversal impact, a cross-cutting impact on all SDGs. These include notably the green and circular economy, the blue economy, innovation, digitalization, sustainable tourism, and human capital. Next slide. And what's important to note here is that these do not exist in a vacuum, but are also required to be integrated both vertically in the sense that Cabo Verde as a small island developing state needs to work across a number of global, regional, country, and local frameworks, particularly because the internal market is very small. In fact, its main source of income, which is the tourism sector, which constitutes, when you consider the tourism related to it as well, almost 40% of GDP. So that in alone shows how integrated Cabo Verde is with other regions. And also between these sectors, there's a lot of interdependence, and none of them can be treated mutually as mutually exclusive or in isolation, which also has implications for all actions related to climate change. Next slide. And an example of this would be some work that we're doing in terms of the blue economy, where shipping, for example, accounts for 2.5% of global emissions and is an important contributor, therefore, to climate change. And if we look at aspects like fuel bunkering, where the World Bank has recently identified Cabo Verde as having potential, then we can combine areas of blue and green economy through renewable energies that can address some of these aspects that include both private and public forms of investment and financing. Next slide. So just to give a quick recap of some of the main NDC targets that over the next 5 to 25 years, they all have links to these Sdg Accelerators. So if you can see on the left-hand side, there's a column of all the relevant Sdg Accelerators that I just described. And on the right hand, the main NDC targets that were identified in this year's submission to the Paris Agreement. Next slide. And what's important to note in this context is the synchronization, if you will, between the Ambition 2030 and the NDC, as well as the financing mechanisms by which to achieve them. So as I mentioned earlier, the Ambition 2030 process was launched last year, but it was a continuation of what we call here the PEDS, the Strategic Development Plan, and that already began in 2017. And as you can see down below, this also coincided with the legal, or let's say the legal adoption of the NDC, which means that these were developed in parallel since the beginning. But now with COVID-19, which is signified by the red blocks there in the middle for 2021, a lot of changes had to be made to the initial assumptions going into both of these frameworks. And so in a way, the timing of what looks like here very parallel processes was quite convenient. But the challenge is going beyond synchronization and actually integrating these into a common financing strategy. And that's where you see on the moving forward, you have the INFF and the NDC financing frameworks also running here in parallel, but with the idea to encourage interaction between these in the form of a unified financing strategy that can allow all of these needs to be met. Next slide. So how are we going to do this? Well, it begins with a focus on how to integrate the NDC financing framework into the 3 blocks. So in the block 1, we have the development finance assessment that I already mentioned would be aligned with the review and mapping of existing financing for the NDC, which essentially is the same function as also the DFA, and the assessment of effectiveness, needs and gaps. There's a team of consultants working on this, and the idea then, if you go to the next slide briefly, is that within this DFA, well, not within the DFA main report, but there's a DFA main report that looks at the comprehensive picture, but with a number of deep dives, including one on climate finance, that focus in particular on the specific issue, but without losing sight of the whole. Can we just go back very briefly to the previous slide, please? So then also within block 2, there's the financing strategy, which the development of the NDC financing framework would have to be very much integrated into the financing strategy, because we're not dealing with separate resource streams here, but it's all coming essentially out of the same pot. And then INFF Block 3, looking at monitoring and review. There we're also working on INFF dashboard that will give us a more or less real-time or at least periodic updates of the main indicators related to the INFF, which should also include the main climate indicators in order to, again, have coherence between them. Can we go forward, please? One more. Ultimately, the coordination between these various actors and mechanisms is crucial in order to make this all work. For this reason, climate issues are very much mainstreamed within the broader coordination system under Block 4 that we're in the process of designing for the INFF. That begins in the top left-hand corner with the main frameworks that inform the INFF, but it also includes climate and green economy considerations as a key working group corresponding to the 5 Sdg Accelerators, as well as climate diplomacy as a key function of the new diplomatic paradigm under the leadership of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As mentioned earlier, this is really not only a whole of government approach, but incorporates the main development partners, civil society, private sector to the greatest extent possible. Next slide. So just to conclude, by trying to integrate the NDC financing framework into the broader INFF framework, we're seeking to avoid duplication and overlap. We're trying to promote coherence, prioritization, sequencing, and choices and trade-offs, because essentially all of, in a context of finite resources, ultimately choices have to be made, and not everything can be done simultaneously. And then when we're talking about climate change or any other sustainable development challenge, timing can sometimes be crucial because we always have to think of the catalytic effects that particular investments may have down the road. We're also trying to promote economies of scale, where, as I suggested earlier, in the example of greening the blue, we might be able to identify particular resources that can have both effects in terms of climate mitigation or adaptation, at the same time as promoting certain forms of economic development and that are consistent with ESG or other sustainability principles. Then we're also trying to address what you can call the calculation problem, in the sense that development finance isn't static, particularly when we're talking about revenues derived from the private sector. These are contingent upon the revenue projections from an economic system that's dynamic and changes over time, as we saw with COVID and its impact on the tourism sector, that led to high increases in the debt to GDP ratio, but that will also can be mitigated, or the economy can be stimulated through various forms of climate finance that give the government more fiscal space to invest in climate finance. Ultimately, we also need to think about fungibility. So, climate finance, even when it's earmarked, it comes from the same source or the same pot. And so you can't really treat it in isolation from other sources of financing challenges. And ultimately, if you did separate climate from other sustainable development goals, you have the issue of endogeneity, which is that climate impacts both financing, because let's say, the impact of climate on agriculture reduces revenues, that has an impact on financing. And at the same time, financing has impacts on sustainable development objectives, which also include various indicators related to climate. So in short, climate issues and climate financing cannot be analytically separated from the broader development landscape in any meaningful way. So that's why this integration between the two, from our point, is essential. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for quite an informative presentation. Without really wasting time, let me allow Hilary to make her inputs. Over to you, Hilary.
Good afternoon, team, and good morning for those who are still in different time zones, and greetings from Nairobi. Hilary Korir here from the National Treasury and Planning in the Republic of Kenya. Unfortunately, I'll not be able to share my slides. I prepared them. It wasn't ready enough in time for them to be translated to the other languages. So I'll just speak to them and take the shortest time possible. I hope I'm audible enough. Solani, could you confirm?
Yes, you are, Hilary. You may proceed.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll just share some, probably maybe in form of country experiences for us in Kenya in terms of climate financing at both the national and the county level. So in Kenya, we have the national government and 47 county governments. And environment and climate change issues is one of the devolved function or a decentralized function, which is mainly dealt with by the county governments. At the national level, we are left with policy issues and the policy directions in matters of climate change and green economy issues. So at the National Treasury, we have a unit called Climate Finance and Green Economy Unit. That is where I'm based. So we mainly coordinate climate finance related activities, the green economy, and this is as provided for in our Climate Change Act of 2016. The Climate Change Act of 2016 mandates all government institutions to establish a climate change unit. So for the National Treasury, we established as a Climate Finance and Green Economy Unit. We also serve as the National Designated Authority for the Green Climate Fund. So just more of the background for us as a country in terms of climate change. Our economy is mostly dependent on climate sensitive sectors, that is agriculture, issues of forestry, wildlife, and others. And it's estimated that the cost of climate change is between 2 to 2.4% of our total GDP. And in our latest report that we released early this year, the landscape of climate finance, in 2017 alone, we spent about 2.4 billion Kenya shillings on issues of disaster related activities. So as I mentioned, environment is one of the devolved function, and our main role at the national level is a coordinative role. So in terms of addressing climate change, both at the national and county level, we've had some good milestones as a country in terms of preparing the groundwork, in terms of developing the necessary policy and legal frameworks. And our journey started in the year 2010 when we developed the first document addressing climate change. That was the National Climate Change Response Strategy. This was immediately followed by our action plan. That was the National Climate Change Action Plan of 2013 to 2017. We've revised that one. We are currently implementing an action plan of 2018-2022. There's other policy documents that we've developed and action plans like the National Adaptation Plan of 2015 to 2030. We have the main one now, which is the Climate Change Act of 2016, which clearly provide the mandates and prescribe some institutional framework for us actually to address or respond to climate change actions. We also have in terms of financial issues and trying to mobilize climate finance resources, we have the National Policy on Climate Finance, which was approved by our National Assembly in 2018. Is the policy that we are working on at the moment. We are implementing some priority actions and interventions that were actually outlined there. I'll mention later what was some of the objectives and actions that were highlighted in that policy for us to address. And most importantly is that in terms of our development agenda as a country is guided by our Vision 2030 and implemented through our medium-term plans. At the county level, we have the county integrated development plans. And in those, the MTPs and the county integrated development plans, we've mainstreamed climate change actions in those planning documents. And most importantly is that at the county level, we have all the counties now moving towards establishing or developing their county-specific action plans, laws, and regulations for them to be able to address climate change actions. So I mentioned our policy, which is more of guiding us at the National Treasury in terms of the climate finance agenda, whereby the main objectives of that policy was, one of them was actually to guide us and promote increased financial flows. Another point is for to enable us to track and report climate finance expenditure. And I think that is one of the activity that we've significantly done in Kenya. And I think from the previous presenters, I think I've seen that most of the countries are actually on the same track in terms of tracking and also preparing the necessary frameworks for them to tag or track climate finance flows. The other objective was also to enhance our private sector participation. Another one was on technology transfer, to accelerate technology transfers. And the final objective was to enhance benefit sharing from the proceeds of climate change. So in terms of the budgeting process at the national level, whereby the National Treasury plays a key role, is that, as I mentioned, we are guided by the Vision 2030 and our planning documents, that is the medium-term plan and the county integrated development plan, we've mainstreamed climate change actions. And in terms of budgeting process, we have sector working groups. We have 24 sectors, and we have now two thematic sector working group, and one of them is climate change, to ensure that we've actually mainstreamed climate change actions in the development plans. We are not yet there, but we've done some significant steps in terms of ensuring that all development plans in the different ministries and different government agencies have climate change components in that. And that one can be attested by the fact, or by the report that we recently released, the report of the landscape of climate finance, where it shows actually the climate relevant expenditure in all our ministries, in all our development programs as a country. So that is in terms of us mainstreaming climate change actions and ensuring that we've prioritized climate change actions in all our development programs. At the county level also, they follow the same route. They follow the same procedures. For us at the national level, we have the budget policy statement. At the county level, they have the county strategy paper, which is guided by the ministers at the county level in terms of finalizing or implementing climate change actions. And currently, we have counties actually developing the county climate change funds. At the national level, we are developing the National Climate Change Fund. We haven't finalized in terms of development, but we've seen success stories at the county level. We have about, as I mentioned, we have 47 county governments. Currently, we have about 30 counties which have actually developed their necessary legislations on climate change, and more specifically, actually establishing county climate change funds. That is, I believe, one of success stories that we are trying as a government to ensure that we have counties actually budgeting for climate change actions. In terms of tracking, I think I have two minutes to go. We've done some significant steps in terms of tracking our climate-related expenditure, a journey that we started in the year 2015 by developing a climate change coding report, whereby we proposed a system to be incorporated in our information system that is at the national level, for us to be able to track climate finance flows automatically. I think that one has probably been mentioned by some of the colleagues in the previous presentations. And last year, actually, our cabinet secretary of the minister issued a circular mandating all government entities and all non-governmental entities to actually report on their climate finance flows. And that was more of a stepping stone. It will enhance our tracking process. It will enable us to collect the data from all government entities and also the non-state actors for us to be able to report adequately on our climate finance spending. And I think our report is available online, which you can all check. We have some ongoing activities in terms of climate finance. We are currently, we have a program called Financing Locally Led Climate Action Program, whereby we are now trying to do a multi-sector and multi-donor financing for climate change actions. So we have a program in place now, and the target for that program is actually to support locally led climate change actions. And that, by that one, I mean the county governments, to support the counties in terms of addressing the local initiatives. And I believe I'll not speak much into that one, but in case of there is any question, I'll be happy to respond. Thank you, Solani, back to you.
Thanks, Hilary. Let me hand over to our colleague from OECD.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes, you are audible.
Maybe I do want to proceed. Can I maybe share slides too? One. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So maybe I will share some slides and took like 5 minutes to explain maybe.
Sorry, unfortunately, it won't be possible to share the slides because we'd have to translate them first to French and Portuguese. So if you could just maybe make your intervention.
In English.
No, sorry.
That's okay, don't worry. I will send them to you just after the meeting so all the presenters could have them.
Okay, also, great. Then we'll translate them and make them available on the website after the event. Thank you so much.
Okay, so good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So my name is Margot Lidon and I'm policy analyst at the OECD, specialized in green budgeting. And I was like previously deputy head of office at the budget directorate of the French Ministry of Economy and Finance. I have, for example, put in place the green budget in France. And so this presentation will focus like on practical ways and benefits in which country can use like green budgeting and financing. And what I note first is, first of all, is that Kenya and Cape Verde are really advanced and are putting in place elements and methods to integrate like green budgeting within their internal frameworks. So, and we could also mention maybe Cameroon, Ethiopia, Morocco, or Senegal, which are developing innovative practice in this field. And the development plans of some African countries include the creation of a green and resilient economy among their strategic priorities. So many African economies are preparing longer-term development packages, which provided opportunities to include like green dimension to the package of initiatives and financing. And I think this inclusion allows to support the climate finance agenda with new budget and financial options and measures linked with green national and international objectives. So what we have to keep in mind is that green recovery will require concerted policy action. And it will also have to prioritize green policy choices that help to promote climate objectives, to have to speed up structural changes toward a low carbon transition, to increase also society's resilience to filter shocks and to reduce future risks. So if I have to discuss a little bit more about green budgeting, maybe for us, green budgeting describes the integration of environmental and climate criteria into the budget cycle to enable decision makers to understand and guide budgetary choices. Indeed, it will strengthen also the transparency of expenditure management. And to speak from my experience in OECD country, if I have to have a look at the practice, more than a third of OECD countries, for example, practices some form of green budgeting and financing strategies. So, but like countries do not necessarily use the same type of tools and methods, which are in fact adapted to their internal practices. And in particular, for example, I work with countries that want to develop like budget tagging, as we saw before, or green expenditure reviews, green performance reviews, for example. And often in parallel with they develop other reforms such as the SDGs, or like pure budget and financial reforms, such as like a program-based budgeting and green bonds, for example, but I will speak a little bit about it later. And at the local level, initiatives are really being developed at the regional or city levels. And we can see it in some municipalities in all countries. So, as you know, green budgeting is really, and financing is an innovative practice, but it's new and also evolving with a common objective for country. It's to comply with their national and international commitments, such as the Paris Agreement. However, we have a general framework, which is at the heart of the practice. And our framework is composed of 4 building blocks. And firstly, a strong strategic framework, which will provide information on climate objective and which clear institutional arrangement for the leadership of green budgeting and financing. Secondly, the green budgeting tools and method, which will align with climate objectives contained in the framework. And thirdly, the effort to promote accountability and transparency. At the end, the enabling environment should ensure the implementation of green budgeting results. And all have to be really integrated into the budget cycle by different ways. So if we are more focusing on green financing, how can like green financing practice and green budgeting practices help to create fiscal space and mobilize additional resources? So as we know, we have like green spending reviews, which will help to make transfers and to have option of financing across government. We also have like the green budgeting also help to prioritize investment to support like low carbon recovery. And also you can also use like green tax policy to help to have new revenue raising components. And another tool is sovereign green bonds. So green bonds, they are not a new instrument, but they are increasing since the COVID-19 crisis. And they have become an important source of revenue for governments to finance their recoveries. Like for example, in Kenya, Morocco, Namibia, Nigeria, South Africa, or also by the African Development Banks. So from a debt management perspective, so a climate financing perspective, issuing a new instrument will help to enhance the financing capacity of sovereigns and to diversify the funding sources of a country. So to help country governments and administrative teams, the OECD has published a number of tools and documents ranging from green budgeting to expenditure review. And if you're interested in these topics and our work, the OECD has published several recent papers, and that may help you in your green budgeting practices. And I will send to you the link. And also do not feel free to go to our website or to contact me directly. So I give you the floor back.
Thanks a lot. Over to Gemma from the IMF.
Good morning. Can you see me there?
Yes, you may proceed.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Zolani, and good to be with you, everyone. I think that we've had some very interesting presentations this morning, and some very excellent points I think were particularly well made. I think some of the things I found most pertinent, particularly in Cape Verde, was really this very clear sense that there is a clear national strategy, Cape Verde 2030, and that really sets out the ambitions and goals of the country in terms of reacting to climate change. And then there does seem to be a very clear process in terms of thinking about, well, how can we operationalize these goals by making sure we really link them very closely with various sources of finance, which I think is critically important. On the presentation we heard from Hilary just now in relation to how things have been working in Kenya, what I thought was very interesting was just hearing all of the different elements that have been deployed across the budget process to really think about integrating climate and climate aspects into the way the budget unfolds in Kenya. One particular thing that was of interest was the discussion around establishing these climate finance and green economy units. This is something that we're starting to see in countries, not just for coordination, as Hilary mentioned, but actually to try to take a more strategic approach to how countries think about financing some of their climate goals and ambitions, and to really try to take that step back, think about what are the adaptation needs of countries or mitigation projects that are needed, and then to try to take a more strategic approach to match those goals and projects with the most strategic sources of finances that are available. And for climate financing, there are more sources of financing available than perhaps what has been traditionally the case. So I did think it was very interesting just to hear also about the different elements of PFM that are being deployed in Kenya across the budget cycle. I heard mention of having very clear goals, being able to connect them to the resource framework across the medium term, as well as lots of work happening in terms of climate spending and climate tracking. And a mention of how important it really was to get the climate angle, climate perspective integrated into the budget circular, because this really helped to then set and guide the process going forward. So, I mean, for me, I think that the key takeaways overall from these presentations is really just how critical it is to integrate climate finance into budgets and into PFM systems overall. And it's not just critical, but it's necessary, and it's necessary to attract alternate sources of finance needed to fund these goals. And many sources of alternate finance actually demand very strong and robust PFM systems to be able to unlock some of this finance. What we've read in the keynote paper for this session is that, of course, getting our PFM systems right can actually present us with significant implementation challenges. But of course, in spite of these challenges, it's important that we persist. And really, the reason is that when it comes to tackling climate threats, all of us need to step up our game. I think addressing climate threats and the impact that they have on our lives and livelihoods is one of the biggest challenges that we'll face in our time. And so making sure that we can design policies that fight climate change, but then actually be able to fund and resource them, I think is critically important. And this is where it's really necessary to make sure that we can connect policies to fight climate change with government budgets, and in turn, ensure that all climate flows from all sources are integrated into the budget and that they're supported by a sound PFM framework and system. Now, at the IMF, we have been thinking about this issue a lot, and the integration of green and climate considerations into the budget is something that we're calling green PFM. It was a bit broader than green budgeting, but it's really taking a whole of system approach and thinking about how we can best integrate different tools, different PFM tools and processes across the entire budget system to make sure that we have an integrated strategy to fight climate change. It's not requiring a new system or a reinvention of PFM practices, but really it's a reframing to bring in a climate perspective. And so in some ways it's very similar actually to the techniques that we've been using in terms of gender budgeting. So a very comprehensive approach there. And I am seeing that I'm being asked to wrap up. So let me do this, but let me just say that I think it's been very nice to join you on the panel today. We've had some very interesting discussion, and I very much look forward to being engaged further in future. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot to all the panelists that have made quite informative contributions. As I hand over to you, Shanaz, what came through for me, and I think it links to the points that all the presenters have made. As we deal with climate change, as it might be affecting us even today, what is important is integrated thinking, integrated planning, and most importantly, is to develop long-term strategies without giving in to pressure that we experience today, so that we can be in a position to deal with this big elephant that we are faced with. Also, thanks, Chris, for your proactiveness in dealing with the questions on the chat box, as we will not be having time to take those questions. On that note, thanks once more to the fellow panelists. It's back to you, Shanaz.